In the Trenton Public Library, stories dating back to the foundation of the city have been collected and preserved. One story in particular tells of an especially heinous murder mystery known as the Changewater Murders. This is that story. On May 1st, 1843, the small and quiet village of Changewater, New Jersey was brought to a standstill when the body of John Kastner was found in a sinkhole only 250 yards away from his home, where his wife, daughter, and brother-in-law had all been murdered that same night. For over 2 years, the crime went unsolved as two men, Peter Park and Joseph Connor, went through trial after trial until May of 1845, when both men were judged guilty and sentenced to a public execution. It seemed that the case was closed and the families of all involved could finally reach some sort of closure. But upon further investigation decades later, it seems that there's much more than meets the eye to this story. And the two men sentenced to death may actually have been innocent the entire time. John B. Park was a farmer who lived at the Changewater farm with his sister Sarah. Over the years, he had made lots of money buying and selling land. He owned and had interest in many properties with $10,000, about $400,231.08 today, out on loan to his neighbors, along with thousands of dollars in cash stored at the house. Also living on the farm were his brother-in-law, John Kastner, and his wife, Maria Park, along with their daughter, Maria Matilda, and their two sons, Victor and John. Joseph Carter had married John B. Park's niece, while Peter Park was John Park's nephew. With so many similar names in this scenario, this could get hard to follow, so I've made this family tree for you to get an understanding of the situation before we dive into the timeline of events. Between 7 and 8 p.m. on May 1st, the Park-Kastner family ate dinner together after a hard day's work. Maria cooked for the family, and John Park had supper with them. After John finished eating, he went to bed and immediately fell asleep, same with their farmhand Jesse Force. Kastner then went to go do bookwork with his farm ledger, something he insisted on doing every night, as Maria was taking care of the baby. Between 9 and 10 p.m., as Kastner finished up his work, there was a loud knock on the door. He grabbed his pistol and asked, "Who's there?" and a familiar voice answered, "It's me, John." Kastner asked again, and the visitor identified himself. It was someone that John and Maria knew well, so they unlatched the door and let him in. Down the hill, shortly after 9 p.m., Eliza Case heard a man holler loudly from the direction of the Park house. Next door, Charlie Myers was finishing up work in his blacksmith shop when his dog was going insane, barking up a storm, running up and down the hill. All the other dogs in the neighborhood were barking up a storm and raising hell as if trying to get the people's attention. Between 5 and 6 a.m. the next day, Stacy Boley woke up and started on his nearly 4-mile walk to work in Port Colden. About 20 minutes into his walk, he crossed the bridge into Warren County, passing John Park's house going up the hill. On that walk, he approached a very large sinkhole in the road that was about 6 feet deep when he spotted something strange in it. The body of a man face down and covered in mud, with a lot of blood on his face and a large fence rail across the side of his head. Overcome with fear, Stacy sprinted back down the hill to the nearby Park house to give alarm to them. To his surprise, there was no answer despite his furious and frantic pounding on every door of the house. He continues to run in the direction of the bottom of the hill when he ran into two mill workers, James Petty and Peter Venata, who he breathlessly tells what had happened. The two immediately shut down their mill and made their way across the creek, gathering a crew of 5 men to help, consisting of James Hazlitt, Jacob Curling, John Vanderbilt, Henry Eli, and Garrett Pittenger. They joined Peter, James, and Stacy as they made their way to the sinkhole to investigate what had really happened. After arriving at the sinkhole, James Petty immediately recognized the body of John Kastner, a regular customer at the mill. He knew him by his work clothing without even needing to see his face. A group of men decided to go back to the Kastner house to try and investigate why nobody had answered the door earlier. When they tried to open one of the doors, they found it to be mysteriously unlocked, and upon entering the house, they would unfortunately see that Kastner's wife Maria and her daughter Maria Matilda were on the bed, both murdered. In the next room, they would find farmhand Jesse Force lying on the bed with his head propped up by his hands. He was very badly wounded and bleeding out, but he was still alive. When recounting the events later on, he had no memory of the attack itself. Then, entering John B. Park's bedroom, they saw him laying on his back in bed with a blanket covering him and a pillow on his face. They lifted the pillow to see a terrifying sight. He had unfortunately been struck in the head several times by the murderer, with his skull sticking out above his ear. The murderer had made a special effort to make sure that he was dead. The last discovery in the home would be another bedroom with 9-year-old Victor and 6-year-old John P. Kastner, who were thankfully sound asleep and unharmed, unaware of what had gone on that night. A horrible tragedy taking place at the farm, destroying an entire family overnight for seemingly no reason. The two men, Joe and Pete, who would go on to be judged guilty of the crime, would hear the news later that day, setting them down a path that would forever change their lives. At 7:30 in the morning at Peter Park's shoe shop, Lyndon Lyman entered and told him the news that his uncle had died. He dropped to his chair and was moving his head from side to side. Strangely enough, he had known that there were several plans and attempts to previously rob him before, and he expected to hear this tragic news at one point, as one too many people found out about all that cash John kept in his house. Peter then immediately left his shop to head up to Changewater, stopping by Joe Carter's farm on the way to tell him and his wife Olivia. He got to the house about 8:15 and told Olivia of the news before asking where Joe was, who was out plowing the field. He told him of the murders and he couldn't believe it, but he agreed to go to Changewater with Peter. They arrived at 9:30 a.m. at the sinkhole, unable to stomach what they were seeing. At 9:55 a.m., the bodies of John Kastner and John Park were finally recovered as Joe and Pete held back tears over what had happened to their friends and family. So, how do these two men crying at the scene of the crime end up being publicly executed for these crimes? Both men were shortly taken into custody after that on suspicion of murder, as the town was going mad theorizing what could have happened to the family. With no direct suspects or leads, the prosecution was doing everything they could, using any information that could even be slightly incriminating to arrest someone to tie up this case, and that brought them to Peter and Joe. The biggest thing that indicted Joe was his financial situation. Allegedly, a few days before the murders, Joe had no money and was asking around to borrow money. Many people had asked Joe to pay him back, and he was telling everyone that he had no money. Peter Van Dorian testified against Joe for this money. Later on, Van Dorian would concede that he had taken a considerable interest in finding the murderer, but denies that he did it just for the cash reward attached. Shortly then after the murders, Joe was able to pay off a lot of his debtors in money totaling up to about $75.50. It was suspected that he had used the money that John had hidden in his house, and that was his motive for the murder. Joe says that he had to dig into his savings from his time in New York, which he hadn't been using out of fear of losing his home. On June 2nd, 1843, Joe had actually been discharged from arrest by 3 magistrates with a unanimous verdict that there was not enough evidence to warrant his commitment. It seemed like the case had ended there, but prosecutor William Morris saw things going differently after 5 weeks working on this case with nothing to prove for it. Morris saw this as an opportunity to become famous and well known as the man that solved the Changewater murders, and he was willing to do whatever it took to be the one who solved this case. He then went on to assemble a grand jury with the only evidence of Joe's financial situation, indicting him on 4 counts of murder that he would go back on trial for the next 2 years. The prosecution was determined to get Joe arrested and sentenced for the murders, trying to find as much circumstantial evidence as possible. They were using stories of his behavior after the murders to try and paint a certain picture of him to the jury. The biggest piece of evidence that came out of these new trials was all about a letter. Someone was testifying against Joe, saying that they had received a letter from him talking about the murders before Joe had even found out about them. The date that the letter was sent was in question, and throughout the entire trial, this letter could never even be produced. Even going back to Joe's financial situation before and after the murders, the prosecution's own witness testified saying that very little to no money had been stolen from the house. Despite the weak evidence that the prosecution had, it seemed like Joe's fate was sealed. There was nothing that tied him to the crime itself, and he should have been a free man, but they would not rest until he was found guilty. Shortly after Joe's trials began, Peter was put on trial for the murder. Jesse Tiger and Margaret Martinez both testified against Pete at his 5th trial with damning evidence, but for some reason it took them 5 trials to come forward with this evidence, and they never testified at Joe's trials that happened earlier. Tiger claimed that he talked to Pete and Joe, who made him offers to help kill John Kastner and take his money, but he changed his story's location twice when telling it in the courtroom. Margaret testified saying that she had seen Pete and Joe talking at the Park farm about if they looked guilty at 10 a.m. the next day, despite it being proven impossible since Pete was at the murder scene until 11 a.m. that day. These 2 very important players entered the trials with strong evidence that potentially led to Peter being convicted, but they also entered way too late. It's very strange that they had this circumstantial evidence that they never even testified against Joe with, despite him playing just as big a part of these stories they were telling at Peter's trials. Despite everything, on May 22, 1845, both Joe and Pete were sentenced to be hung in 3 months' time on August 22nd. Both tried to appeal the sentencing, but the judges turned a deaf ear. They would never stop saying that they were innocent and even went on to write their side of the story in prison for it to be published and hopefully have their names cleared. Despite the facts and having it proved impossible for the two to have killed John Kastner and his family, both men were convicted and condemned to die in a public execution. To this day, we're left with many questions about this horrible tragedy. Were Joe Carter and Peter Park guilty? Did pressure from the town and prosecution looking to solve the murder of the century lead them to punish two innocent men? What really happened that night at the Park family farm? It seems that unfortunately we will never find the answers as we stand here nearly 200 years later without any new developments, and that this case will forever remain unsolved.
To learn more about this and other Trenton relics, visit Trentoniana at the Trenton Free Public Library or log on to trentonlib.org/Trentoniana.